Blood slicked her arm as Sikya raised her knife, ready to kill the stranger climbing toward her, never guessing she would call him worth a bloodline before that week was out. The shot that opened her forearm was still ringing off the stone above her head. 3 riders were somewhere behind her in the wash, spread wide the way men spread when they mean to box something in, rather than simply run it down. Her legs had carried her past the point where legs are supposed to give out, and now there was nowhere left to run but into a fold of black boulders around a dying fire. Her fire lit 2 nights before, back when she still believed she could outlast them on her own. She heard boots, not a horse's tread, a man on foot leading an animal, quiet through the wash, the careful way a person moves who is either hunting something or trying very hard not to be mistaken for a threat. She set her back to the stone, tightened her grip on the knife, and waited to learn which one he was. This is New Mexico territory, late summer of 1884, and the woman bleeding in those rocks is Sikya, the last of her family's line still standing on ground a cattle baron named Vance Halloran has decided belongs to him. He has already pushed the rest of her band south with fire and threats and men paid to make either one convincing. He wants Sikya taken alive, not dead, so he can put her in front of what's left of her people and prove that resistance ends in submission and nowhere else. The man climbing toward her is Ezra Calloway, a drifter no town within 200 miles will let sleep past its limits, cleared by a jury for killing men who had once ridden as his friends and exiled by every one of them anyway. Neither of them knows yet that the next stretch of days, a canteen, a creek, a ridge, and a porch standoff lit by lantern light, will end with her looking at his shaking hands and telling him in front of witnesses that a man like him deserves to carry on his bloodline. Stay with this one to the end. The porch scene alone is worth the whole ride. 2 nights before that porch, though Sikya had nothing but a knife, a fire burning down to coals, and a stranger's shadow sliding around the rock toward her. Her grandmother used to say the land remembers who feeds it and who only takes, and Sikya had carried that teaching through every hard season since. She had been a girl the first time soldiers rode through her family's camp with orders and no patience for questions, and older harder, the day Halloran's money bought the same old order in new clothes. Most of her band had judged the cost of staying too high and gone south toward reservations, and rationed flour and a peace that wasn't peace so much as surrender written slow. Sikya had judged it differently. She had stayed because someone had to, and because the alternative felt like agreeing with every man who had ever told her people they didn't belong on their own ground. That choice was the whole reason 3 riders were combing the wash behind her now, and she did not regret it, even bleeding, even alone, even with her back against cold stone and a stranger's shadow closing the last few feet toward her fire. Ezra had seen the smoke before he saw her, a thin gray thread rising off a ring of stone kept deliberately small, the fire of someone who didn't want to be found, rather than someone who didn't need the warmth. He'd left his mare in the wash and come up on foot, rifle slung but not raised, running through the same short list he always ran through before rounding a blind corner. In this country, friend, enemy, or somebody desperate enough to mistake him for either. Then he came around the boulder and found a 4th answer he hadn't planned for. A young Apache woman sat with her back against the stone, a split lip, a strip of blooded cloth knotted at her forearm, and a knife held low and steady in her free hand. Her eyes found him and did not let go. He read the ground before he read her face, a scuff trail leading in off the flats, broken brush, the particular stillness of a person who has been running longer than her body wanted to allow. He knew that stillness. He had worn a version of it himself for 3 years. He set his canteen down in the dirt, in plain sight, and lifted both hands so she could see exactly what he carried and what he didn't. There's water in that. I'm not asking anything for it. She didn't move for a long moment, weighing the offer the way any stranger's kindness gets weighed out here as a possible mercy or a possible trick, with no easy way from where she sat to tell which. Then she reached out, took the canteen without letting the knife leave her other hand, and drank in careful, measured swallows, watching him over the rim the whole time. He knelt by his mare and busied his hands with the cinch, giving her something else to look at besides his face. Out of the corner of his eye he watched her drink again, then set the canteen down with a precision that made plain she had rationed worse than water before. "You're alone." "Not a question, I am." Nothing more than that. He'd learned in the towns that wouldn't have him that extra words usually just handed people more to twist. He studied the bandage on her arm, soaked through and days old by the color of it, and the fresh graze of a bullet scored pale across the boulder, just behind where she'd been sitting. Someone had put that mark there recently. He reached into his saddlebag, drew out a clean strip of shirt cloth he kept rolled for exactly this kind of morning, and held it up before coming any closer, the way a person shows an animal. "They mean no harm." She watched him cross the last few feet, and extended her arm without a word. He unwound the old cloth carefully, and where the wound showed beneath it, a clean tear, already ugly at the edges, he worked quickly and kept his hands no longer at her skin than the knot required. He tied off the last knot. "There's a creek 2 miles east of here. Shallow, good cover, better water than what's in that canteen. You'll heal faster there than in these rocks." She studied him a long moment, reading him the way she'd been reading tracks her whole life. The set of his shoulders, the calluses on the hand that had tied the bandage, the rifle he hadn't once pointed her direction. Finally, she pushed herself up off the stone before he could answer, testing her own weight, deciding for herself when they would go. "We move when the light bends. All right." He did not argue with the woman who had clearly been deciding things for herself long before he showed up. He sat back against the mare's flank and let the silence hold between them while the fire burned down to nothing. Behind the calm he kept on his face, old fear worked through his chest, memories of other fires and other supposed truces that had turned to ambush before the coffee cooled. But something else was moving in him too, something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit, the pull of standing beside someone else's fight, instead of only ever guarding his own retreat. He hadn't planned on staying. His whole plan for 3 years running had been simple. Keep moving, keep quiet, never give a town cause to look at him twice. But watching this woman hold herself together with nothing but a knife and a will that hadn't cracked yet, he found he wasn't in a hurry to ride on. Not yet. When the sun tipped west and the worst of the heat finally broke, they moved. Sikya walked a half pace behind him, her knife back in its sheath at her hip, her wounded arm held tight to her body the way a person holds something they refuse to let slow them down. Ezra kept himself slightly ahead, rifle within reach, and didn't slow his pace to spare her, because he understood the way a man understands a thing without needing it spelled out. That slowing down for her would read as pity, and pity was a coin neither of them could afford to spend out here. She hadn't given him her name yet. He hadn't asked. He recognized that particular silence, the kind that isn't pride so much as armor, because he had worn a version of it himself since the night his whole life split into a before and an after. Before, he'd been a ranch hand with steady work and men who trusted him at his back. After, a dispute over stolen cattle turned into gunfire in the dark, and when the smoke cleared, 2 men who had once ridden as his friends were dead by his own hand, a jury heard the whole account and cleared him of any crime. The towns never did. Word travels faster than any verdict, and by the time he rode into the next settlement, the story had already arrived ahead of him, twisted just enough to close every door a little faster than the one before it. He had spent 3 years learning exactly how far a man can travel and still never outrun what people have already decided about him. He didn't tell her any of that yet. He only walked and let her measure him the way she seemed to measure everything, the ground, the horizon, the man in front of her, with a caution that had kept her breathing this long. The creek showed itself a mile and a half later, narrow and choked with willow root, but running clear the first honest water either of them had seen in 2 days of dust. Ezra crouched first and tasted the water before offering it, an old habit from a careless younger year, and only then let her kneel and drink until some of the tightness eased out of her shoulders. He picketed the mare to graze the bank while he built a ring of stones for a fire, and Sikya, still watching the tree line with a sharpness that never fully switched off, finally voiced the question he'd been expecting since the rocks. "Why are you out here alone?" He kept his eyes on the stones. "Because nowhere else will have me. I work when there's work, I move when there isn't, and I keep to myself. It's enough." Her gaze held on him a beat longer than was comfortable. "You've killed men." Not a guess. A fact she'd already read off him somewhere between the rocks and the creek. He met her eyes for the first time since the fire. Yes. He didn't reach for the trial or the verdict or any of the words that might have softened it. There didn't seem to be a point. Something tightened in her jaw, and for a moment he thought she might decide, right there at the edge of the creek, that she'd rather finish this stretch of desert without him. Instead, she crouched by the fire ring and started gathering twigs, working the kindling in silence beside him, and he understood that whatever she decided about him, she hadn't decided to leave. Before this story reaches the part that made it worth telling, and it does, on a porch, under lantern light, I'll ask you for something small. If a story like Sikya and Ezra's is worth your time, become a channel member. Tap the join button right beside the channel name. It takes a minute, and it's what keeps stories like this one coming. They built the fire together, and when it caught, Ezra pulled a small pouch of cornmeal from his saddlebag, mixed it with creek water, and set the dough on a flat stone near the flame. Sikya produced a strip of dried meat from her own pack, proof that whatever had driven her into those rocks hadn't caught her entirely unprepared, and they shared both without ceremony, passing what little they had back and forth across the low fire. The quiet between them had changed by then. It wasn't empty anymore. It held the weight of two people who had each begun reading the other's truth. He had seen that she carried violence in her past without being ruled by it. She had seen that he was marked, not broken. Above them, the desert did what it always did, once the heat finally let go of it, opening into a wide, cold spread of stars that neither of them had the luxury of admiring for long. Sikya had learned as a girl to read that same sky for direction and season, the way other people read a clock, and out of old habit she found herself doing it now, even with no particular need to travel by starlight tonight. Ezra watched her do it, the tilt of her head, the stillness in her shoulders, and thought that whatever else this woman had lost, she hadn't lost the parts of herself that made her more than a fugitive fleeing across somebody else's map. She was a person still fully in possession of her own knowledge, her own judgment, her own ground to stand on, even with half of it currently stolen from her. When the fire burned down to coals, Ezra spread his blanket and gestured toward it. She shook her head, firm and settled instead against a willow trunk, with her knife still within reach of her good hand. He didn't argue. He lay back with his hat tipped low over his eyes, but his ears stayed tuned to every shift of wind and every crack of a branch that might be nothing, or might be three riders closing the distance in the dark. Sikya stayed awake long after his breathing slowed. She thought of the men who had chased her across 2 days of flat country, of the family she had lost to Halloran's money and other money like it before him, and of the stranger who had put water at her feet and asked for nothing in return. She didn't trust him yet, but his stillness wasn't the heavy kind. It was steady, and steady was a thing she hadn't known in a long time. Morning broke cold enough to sting before the sun climbed high enough to punish. Ezra was up first, checking the mare's hooves, tightening the cinch, scanning the ridgeline out of habit rather than fear. Sikya woke sharp, the way she always did, her knife still resting across her lap as though she hadn't slept at all. She studied him a long moment before rising and brushing the dust from her skirt with her good hand. The wound looked cleaner under the fresh bandage, though the stiffness in her movements made clear the pain hadn't eased much. He built up the fire again to warm the last of the cornmeal cakes, and while they ate, he finally voiced the question that had been sitting behind his teeth since the rocks. "Those men who shot at you, who are they?" She chewed slowly, eyes on the water, before answering. "Not soldiers, not outlaws either. Men Halloran pays. They burn camps. They push people south, off land that was theirs, long before he ever staked a fence to it. They kill if killing gets it done faster." Her jaw tightened around the words like they tasted of something bitter. "They think we're supposed to just disappear." Ezra felt the weight of that settle into his chest. He'd heard whispers of Vance Halloran in the last town that turned him away. A cattleman with money enough to buy a marshal's silence and patience enough to starve out anyone who wouldn't sell. He had steered clear of Halloran's country on principle alone. It seemed the choice had found him anyway. "Why you not an accusation, a real question?" She lifted her chin. "Because I stayed when the rest of my band went south. Because I stood my ground in front of the men who came to move us and made it plain the land is ours." Something hard flickered behind her eyes, then eased into something closer to exhaustion. "And because they know I don't have anyone left standing beside me to make them think twice." He didn't tell her he understood. He only nodded once, because the truth of it was already sitting in his own chest. He, too, knew what it cost to be the last one left standing when everyone else had gone, or given up, or been driven off. He stood and slung the rifle over his shoulder. "We'll cut west, toward the Black Ridges. Better ground to watch from. They'll expect you to keep running south, toward the water." She gave one short nod and fell into step behind him without a word of thanks. Gratitude, he understood by now, was a currency she wasn't ready to spend on a stranger yet. But she followed. That was enough for one morning they crossed the dry flats, through the worst heat of the day, the mare leaving prints in the hardpan that Ezra wished he could brush away, and knew he couldn't. Sikya walked a few paces behind, silent, her eyes never settling long on any one point of the horizon. Her quiet steadied something in him he hadn't expected to need steadying. He found himself watching the way she moved, across ground that would have swallowed a careless traveler whole, choosing footing without seeming to look for it, reading the flats the way another woman might read a page of familiar handwriting. 3 years of moving alone had taught Ezra plenty about surviving open country, but watching Sikya cross, it reminded him there was a difference between surviving a place and belonging to it. She belonged to this desert in a way he suspected he never would. Not because the land had been kind to her, it plainly hadn't, but because she had never once stopped treating it as home, even while men with money and rifles tried to convince her otherwise. By midday they reached the black basalt outcrops, rising like broken teeth from the desert floor, and Ezra led them into the shadow of a narrow cut where the rock gave them cover. He crouched and ran his fingers over the disturbed dirt at the base of the stone. Hoofprints. 3 cents. Fresh. Sikya knelt beside him and studied the same ground with an ease that made clear this wasn't the first manhunt she'd read the sign of. 3 men. 1 horse rides lame, favors the left front. It stumbles when he pushes it. He looked at her with a surprise he didn't bother hiding. Her reading was precise and confident, the work of someone who had survived on exactly this kind of skill for longer than he guessed. Whatever unease still sat in his chest, eased a fraction, replaced by something closer to respect. They climbed higher, found a shallow pocket of shade with a clear line down into the valley, and settled in to wait. Ezra kept the mare tucked behind rock out of sight and laid his rifle across his knees. Sikya sat close beside him, her bow across her lap, her eyes fixed on the heat shimmer rising off the flats below. For a long while nothing moved. Then, faint on the wind, came voices. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the valley, small against the glare, but unmistakable in the way they spread out to search, restless, careless with their spacing. Men who tracked for pay rather than discipline, but knew their trade well enough to be dangerous anyway. Sikya kept her voice low. "They follow me, not you. You could still leave." Ezra shook his head once. Too late for that. She looked at him a long moment, something shifting behind her guarded expression. Not quite trust, but close enough that she eased her seat a little nearer to his on the rock, her bowstring already drawn taut. The riders worked the valley floor in slow sweeps, spreading wider with every pass, their horses' hooves striking a rhythm against the hard pan that Ezra felt in his back teeth. He and Sikya stayed low in the cut, weapons ready, but not raised, listening to the men close the distance one careless yard at a time. He judged them by the way. They sat their saddles, two loose, two confident men who tracked well enough but had never once imagined the ground fighting back. The sling on the near rider's arm confirmed what Sikya had already read from the hoof prints, and so did the stumble in the lame horse's gait. Their voices carried up on the still air. One rider's voice cut sharp with impatience. "She can't have gone far," a second spat back over his shoulder. "Not with that arm. She won't make the ridges by dark." The third laughed, low and ugly. "And if she does? Ain't nobody fool enough to shelter an Apache running from Halloran's money." Sikya's jaw went tight as stone, her breathing quickened, but she didn't speak, didn't give them the satisfaction of a sound. Ezra understood exactly what that kind of casual cruelty cost. To sit through in silence, men deciding a life was already settled, spoken of the way men speak of weather. The impatient one raised his voice again. "Boss wants her breathing. But if she don't come easy," he let the rest hang and made a gesture. Ezra didn't need to see clearly to understand. Ezra turned to her. "We take them here. Clean, no wasted shots." She nodded once, her face set, her eyes searching his for the first time since the rocks. "You shoot straight?" "Yes." His voice held steady even as the old tightness climbed his chest, the same tightness that had followed him since the night his bullets found men he used to trust. The riders nudged their horses forward, splitting to sweep the ridgeline. Ezra laid his rifle across a folded blanket to steady his aim and chose the impatient one, the leader, reasoning that if he dropped, the others might break on their own. Beside him, Sikya nocked an arrow and drew a bead on the second rider, the one favoring his sling arm. The mare shifted, catching scent of the stranger's horses. Ezra's finger found the trigger. The rifle cracked across the valley. The leader jerked hard in his saddle as the bullet shattered the pistol still holstered at his hip before it ever cleared leather, his arm going dead and useless at his side. In the same breath, Sikya's arrow whistled down and buried itself in the second rider's shoulder, dropping him half out of his saddle with a cry that carried clean across the rock. The third man wheeled his horse, gun hand hovering, eyes scanning wildly for shooters he couldn't place. Ezra chambered another round, but Sikya's hand caught his arm, a sharp, silent weight. She rose, just enough to be seen, bow drawn and steady, her whole body a plain, unmistakable message. She would not run this time. The third rider read that message clearly enough. He hauled his reins hard and bolted, dragging the wounded man's horse along by the lead, the crippled leader cursing behind them both as their shapes shrank into the distance. Ezra lowered his rifle and let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding through the whole exchange. His hands trembled before he willed them still. "You hit?" She shook her head, though blood had soaked fresh through the old bandage from the strain of the draw. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty horizon where the riders had gone. "They'll come back." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "Not tonight, though." For the first time since the boulders, Sikya lowered her bow and sat beside him in the shade of the rock, breathing hard, her shoulders easing by a fraction she didn't try to hide. She had watched him fight, not for glory, not for blood, but simply to keep her standing. Something in her settled around that fact and did not let it go. He tended her arm again in the shade of the rocks, unwinding the bandage, gone dark with fresh blood, cleaning the angry edges of the wound with a thin stream of whiskey from his flask. She hissed through her teeth at the sting but didn't pull away, and he found himself admiring the sheer discipline it took to sit still through that kind of pain without a single wasted word. He tied off the new cloth. "You can't keep fighting like this without rest. I don't stop." Her eyes flicked toward the direction the riders had fled. "If I stop, they take me." He had questions he'd been holding since the rocks, and he finally let one loose. "Who is this boss they answer to? Why does he want you breathing instead of buried?" For the first time, something in her face slipped from stone toward something rawer. "Vance Halloran." Her voice flattened. "A cattleman. He wants the grass and the water my people held long before he ever staked a claim to it. He pays men to clear it of us, and he wants me alive, because if I disappear quiet, or if I bend, then the rest of my people who are still watching will bend too. He wants to make an example." Ezra turned the name over. He'd heard it in more than one town, spoken low, the way people speak of a man with money enough to buy a marshal's silence and patience enough to starve out anyone who wouldn't sell. He'd steered wide of Halloran's country before now on principle alone. It seemed the choice had found him anyway. "We can't stay in open country. They'll comb this ground until they find you again." He looked west, toward a smudge of sun-bleached wood he knew sat at the edge of a dry lake. "There's a trading post 2 hours on Merrick's. The woman who runs it won't turn away paying custom, and if those riders follow, at least we'll have walls and more guns behind us than just the 2 we're carrying." Sikya didn't love the idea of pulling strangers into her fight. He could see that plainly in the set of her shoulders, but she'd run out of better options, and she gave a slow nod instead of an argument. They reached the dry lake by late afternoon, dust clinging to their faces on a wind that never quite let up. What had once been open water, Ezra guessed by the salt-crust ring still marking the flats, had shrunk to nothing but hard white ground and the memory of a shoreline, and Merrick's post sat crooked at the edge of it, sun-bleached boards and a sagging porch, a faded flag lifting weakly off its pole whenever the wind bothered to try. A single wagon rested nearby, its wheels sunk to the hubs in dried mud, abandoned there long enough that nobody had bothered digging it free. Ezra tied the mare to the rail and led Sikya toward the porch, scanning the yard out of old habit before his boot ever touched the first step. The door creaked open before they got there. A broad-shouldered woman in her 50s stood framed in it, a shotgun resting easy against her hip the way some women rest a broom. Mrs. Merrick's first words carried no greeting ahead of them. "You bring trouble." Ezra touched his hat brim. "We bring coin, flour, salt, a little food, and a quiet corner for the night, if you'll have us." Her eyes moved to Sikya, the blood, the exhaustion worn into every line of her, the knife still at her belt, and her expression didn't soften, though she didn't shut the door either. "I don't trade in other people's wars." Sikya lifted her chin. "Then, trade in mine." Her voice came out steadier than her body looked capable of. Something in that answer made Mrs. Merrick pause a long moment before she finally stepped aside. "Come in, then. Keep it quiet. My boys don't need more enemies than they've already got standing on this lake bed." Inside, the post smelled of coffee grounds and tallow candles, a cradle sitting empty near the cold stove, with a folded blanket still tucked inside it. Sikya's eyes caught on it a half-second too long before she looked away, and Ezra filed the moment away the way he filed most things he chose not to press. They bought beans, flour, salt, a spool of thread, and a small jar of salve for the wound. Ezra tried to pay for the whole of it, but Mrs. Merrick pushed half his coin back across the counter. "Keep it. You'll need it worse than I will before this is finished." While Ezra stayed on the porch, rifle across his knees and eyes on the horizon, Sikya wandered to the back room, where the elder of Mrs. Merrick's 2 boys sat sanding down a cracked bow stave. She ran her fingers along the grain, testing the work with a practiced hand. The boy, shy under the weight of her attention, pushed it toward her anyway. "You can have it." I'll pay in work." She carried the wood out and stacked firewood in rows straight enough to satisfy a soldier. The boy trailed after her, watching with the kind of open admiration boys save for people who are plainly better at everything than they are inside. "Mrs. Passy." Merrick filled 2 tin cups with coffee and set them on the counter for Ezra when he finally stepped in from the porch rail. Men came through 2 days back, asking after a girl, an Apache woman, traveling with a drifter is how they put it. I sent them off with nothing. Next time, I might not manage it and keep this roof standing. Ezra lifted the cup, his hand not quite steady, until he set it hard against his leg, to still it. "Then we'll be gone soon as we're able." He knew, even as the words left him, how little a promise like that was worth out here. What mattered was staying ready for whatever came instead of it. 20 miles east, at the edge of a spread, with more fence than any one man needed, the wounded rider sat on an upturned crate, while a hired doctor worked the shattered mess of his pistol arm loose from what was left of the leather holster fused to it. Vance Halloran stood in the barn doorway with his thumbs hooked in his vest, unhurried, the particular stillness of a man who had never once had to raise his own voice to be obeyed. He took in the account without interrupting: a drifter, a rifle, an Apache woman who shot a bow like she'd been born with a string already in her hand. One point mattered to him more than the rest. Was she still breathing? Given yes, he nodded slow, the satisfaction of a man confirming a fact he'd already decided was true before he heard it. He wanted an example, not a corpse, and a corpse taught the wrong lesson to people watching. To see whether resistance cost a life or only cost a person their freedom to keep resisting. He sent the 3 riders back out with 4 more behind them and one instruction: find where they're headed before you find them. He never raised his voice once through any of it. He didn't need to. The men who rode for Vance Halloran understood that his quiet carried more weight than most men's shouting, and none of them meant to be the one who tested how far that quiet would stretch before it broke. One more small ask before the port scene, because it matters more than you'd think for a channel this size. Become a member. The join button sits right beside the channel name. It's the difference between more stories like this one or none at all. Dusk came down flat and red over the sagging boards of Merrick's post, the kind of light that turns every long shadow honest about how little cover is actually left once the sun drops. Ezra sat the porch rail with his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon the way he'd watched it every evening for 3 years running, except this time he wasn't watching only for himself. The first sign was the crunch of hooves on hardpan, faint at first, then unmistakable. 3 riders came out of the west, their shapes cut hard against the dying light. As they closed the distance, Ezra made out the sling on one man's arm, the same rider from the ridge, and the rough, hard-worn posture of men carrying both anger and the confidence of being paid to feel it. They didn't dismount when they reached the post. They lined their horses facing the porch instead, the way men line up a threat they want understood without needing to say it plainly. "Mrs." Merrick stepped out first, shotgun steady against her hip, her voice flat and unbothered. "You bring business. State it. You bring trouble. Take it back to the road." The rider with the sling leaned forward in his saddle. "We want the girl. Hand her over and we ride clear. Don't, and we burn this place to the boards." Before Ezra could answer, Sikya stepped out through the doorway, bow slung across her good shoulder, her injured arm held tight to her side. She moved slow, but there was nothing small about the way she held the porch. Her voice carried clean across the yard. "If you want me, then say my name. Say Sikya, not the girl." The riders shifted in their saddles, unsettled by something they hadn't expected out of her. The leader spat into the dirt. "Makes no difference what you call yourself. Halloran owns this water, this grass, this whole stretch of lake bed you're standing on. You come back with us alive, or you don't come back at all." Ezra stepped forward, then planting himself shoulder to shoulder with her, rifle low but ready, his voice pitched flat and cold as creek water in January. "She's not going anywhere." The standoff held. Behind them, Mrs. Merrick's 2 boys stepped into the doorway, each gripping an old rifle in hands that trembled only a little. It wasn't much of a garrison, but it was enough to tilt the math. 3 riders against 4 guns and 2 people on the porch who weren't backing down an inch. The leader tried to mask a flicker of hesitation behind a sneer. "You think you can stand against Halloran? He's got more men than you can count on both hands. This is a waste. You'll all die out here for nothing." Sikya's answer came sharp and unshaken. "This desert doesn't belong to Halloran. It keeps who it wants to keep. Tonight it keeps me." For a long, taut moment, Ezra thought they might test it anyway. His fingers settled against the trigger guard. His whole body braced for the recoil he dreaded and lived with more times than he wanted to count. But the leader's eyes moved from the rifles in the doorway to Ezra's stance to Sikya's unwavering gaze, and something in him gave way. "This isn't finished," he spat and hauled his reins around hard. "You bought yourselves a night. That's all." The 3 riders wheeled and rode back into the gathering dark, hoofbeats fading until only the wind and the settling boards of the post remained. Inside, the tension broke all at once. The boys laughed too loud, trying to cover how badly their hands were still shaking, and Mrs. Merrick lowered her shotgun with a shake of her head. "You've just made me a target." There wasn't a trace of regret behind it. She poured coffee into tin cups and slid them across the counter. Ezra took his, noticing the tremor in his own hand, before he pressed the cup hard against his leg to steady it. Sikya watched him do it. She didn't call it weakness. She only studied him a moment longer, quiet and plain. "You stayed, I said I would." She held his eyes a moment longer, something in her face easing by the smallest possible degree. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be its cousin. Later, when the coffee had gone cold and the boys had finally settled from the excitement of having stood in a standoff and lived to talk about it, Sikya sat across the low fire from Ezra, watching his hands where they rested on his knees. They still weren't fully steady. She had seen that much on the porch, and she saw it now plain in the firelight. Most men, she had learned across a hard life, tried to hide a tremor like that. Ezra didn't bother. He simply let his hands be what they were and kept his eyes on the flame. Quiet. After herself, the words came anyway. Such a man deserves to carry on his bloodline. The words weren't flattery. They came out of her the way a verdict comes from someone who has weighed the whole case and found no reasonable doubt left standing. She had watched him hold his ground on a porch when running would have cost him nothing. She had watched his hands shake and his boots stay planted anyway. To Sikya raised to measure a person by what they do when running would be easy and free. That steadiness was worth more than any bravado, any easy promise, any man who never once let fear touch his face because he'd never risked enough to feel it. No one in the room laughed. No one questioned it. The words were too plain, too clearly meant, to answer with anything but silence. Ezra sat with the weight of them pressing against his chest, heavier somehow than any bullet he'd ever carried. For 3 years he had measured his worth by the towns that wouldn't have him, by the friends his own hand had put in the ground, by a guilt that never fully set him down. Sikya's words didn't erase any of that. But for the first time since the trial, he felt something rise up beside the guilt instead of underneath it, something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of belonging somewhere. Danger was still out there past the dark edge of the lake bed. Halloran's men hadn't ridden off to surrender. They'd ridden off to regroup, and both of them knew it, but for tonight at least, neither of them was standing alone in it. Morning broke clear and cold over the dry lake, the kind of chill that doesn't last past sunrise, but bites hard while it does. Ezra was already outside tightening the mare's cinch when Sikya stepped onto the porch, her arm freshly wrapped, her steps carrying more strength than they had the night before. The boys were stacking wood at the side of the post, faces bright with the particular pride of having stood in a standoff and come out the other side of it whole. Mrs. Bodger. Merrick came out with her shotgun resting easy on her shoulder, scanning the horizon the same way Ezra had been doing since sunup. They'll be back. Ezra didn't look away from the horizon. I won't let this post burn on our account. He looked west, toward the ridgeline he'd scouted from a distance more than once in his years of drifting. There's a line cabin out past the ridges. Empty a long while now. We'll make it ours. Sikya stayed quiet at first, studying him the way she'd studied him since the rocks. She had expected him to keep running, the way every drifter she'd ever crossed paths with eventually did. Instead, he was talking about staying, about choosing ground and holding it. She gave a small nod. If the land holds water, it will hold us. Mrs. Stan. Merrick stepped closer and pressed a small sack into Ezra's hands. Beans, salt, a second jar of salve. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out an old iron key, setting it into his palm with a firmness that left no room to argue. That cabin was mine, once, her voice roughened around the words. Lost my husband before I ever got to raise a family in it. You keep it, if you can hold it better than I could. Ezra's throat tightened around whatever he might have managed in answer. All that came out was, "Thank you." They rode west that afternoon, leaving the dry lake and its sagging flag behind them. The mare carried the weight of both their supplies without complaint, and Ezra walked much of the distance himself to spare her, rifle slung, eyes steady on the ridgeline, out of habit rather than fear now. Sikya walked beside him, bow across her shoulder, her silence no longer a wall so much as something shared between them. By late afternoon they reached the shallow valley where the cabin stood, roof sagging at one corner, door hanging loose on a single hinge, but the walls sound and true beneath years of neglect. A thin spring trickled from the rocks nearby, feeding a patch of grass green enough to promise the ground could still hold something living. Ezra led the mare to drink while Sikya stepped inside, running her hand across the cold stove, the rough-hewn table, the bed frame leaning tired against the far wall. Dust rose at her touch. Nothing else did. Only a place waiting to be used again. They worked without much talk, falling into a rhythm neither of them questioned. Ezra straightened the door on a bent horseshoe hinge, set his rifle on pegs by the window where it belonged, dug a shallow trench to carry rain away from the threshold. Sikya swept the dust from the floor, and once the worst of the work was done, tied a string of beads and feathers above the doorway. Not decoration, she made plain when he wondered aloud, but a mark. A sign that this ground was claimed now by someone who intended to stay on it. By the time the light started to slant long and gold through the one good window, the cabin had stopped looking like a place somebody had walked away from and started looking like a place somebody meant to live. Ezra found himself noticing small things he hadn't planned on noticing, the way the spring caught the last sun and threw a thin line of gold across the floorboards, the way the grass by the door had already started to green up now that nobody was trampling it flat with fear. He had spent 3 years teaching himself not to notice things like that, because noticing them was the first step toward wanting them, and wanting things in his line of life had only ever led to losing them. He noticed. Anyway, he let himself. When the sun went down, they sat together on the front step and ate beans cooked with salt and the last of the jerky, the mare grazing quietly nearby, the air finally clean of dust and threat both. Ezra looked over at her, finally letting loose the question he'd been carrying since the fire in the rocks. You could have gone south, tried to find what's left of your people. Sikya turned her head. The last light of evening caught in her eyes. Because running never ends. Out here, I'm not only hunted, I'm standing. He let that settle before he shared what he hadn't voiced before. Not even on the porch. I left everything I had because I killed men I used to call friends. The law cleared me. The towns never did. I figured I'd spend the rest of my life moving, waiting on the next door to shut in my face." He paused. "Then you looked at me back at that fire, and you didn't see a man worth driving out." Sikya studied him a long moment, quiet before something soft and rare finally broke across her face. "Because you stayed. I'll keep staying." That night they shared one blanket by the stove. The fire burned low, coyotes calling somewhere out past the ridges. For the first time in 3 years, Ezra let his whole body rest without one ear staying pinned to the dark. Sikya rested her head against his shoulder, and though neither of them spoke a single word of love out loud, both understood exactly what silence had already promised between them. In the morning, they would talk about planting seed near the spring, about trading Mrs. Merrick for a second horse, about a garden that would need tending come the first cool rains. Halloran's men might still be riding somewhere past that horizon, licking their losses, waiting on new orders from a man who didn't like to lose. But neither Sikya nor Ezra lived inside that fear any longer. The running had ended the moment they'd both chosen, without needing to say it plainly, to stand instead. Before sleep finally took him, Ezra let the words go quiet. "I'm here." Sikya didn't hesitate. "Stay. I will." And with that, the story that started with a bullet cracking off stone in a stranger's rocks closed the only way it honestly could, not with a vow made loud from horseback, but with two people who had both been running long enough to know exactly what it costs, choosing instead to stop. 2 lives, marked by exile and loss, made steady at last, not by anything either of them swore out loud, but simply by staying. There will be other mornings past the one this story ends on. Halloran's fences will still stand somewhere east of that spring, and men in his pay will still ride out, looking for ground to clear and people to move off of it. That fight isn't finished, not truly, not for a woman who chose to stay when her whole world told her leaving was the only sane answer. But she has a man beside her now who understands what it costs to be marked by other people's fear of you, and who has already proven, more than once, exactly how far he'll go before his boots stop being planted where he put them. What makes Sikya's line worth remembering isn't the flattery in it, because there wasn't any. It's the appraisal underneath it, a woman who had every reason left in the world to trust no one, weighing a man against the only measure that ever mattered to her, and finding him worth staying for. She didn't choose Ezra because he was strong, or because he saved her, though he did both. She chose him because, when the running could have ended everything between them, he stood anyway, boots planted, hands shaking, and never once looked for the door. If this is the kind of story you come back for, a woman who fights her own fight and still gets to choose the man who stands beside her, then stick around for the next one. If you want to help keep these frontier stories coming, become a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name. Before you go, tell me in the comments, was it the Canteen, the Ridge, or the Porch that won you over? Hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one, out here on the frontier, where the land keeps who it wants to keep,